Adventist bubble. So the best way I can explain an Adventist bubble is that typically revolves around, there's a university that's Adventist University, for example, Loma Linda. You'll find that there's like 20 churches that are Adventist in that Loma Linda. You'll find that the majority of the residents there, people who are living there, are, hey, I just graduated, I'm still living in the area, I'm going to work in the area. And some people like to stay, other people go, but the majority of the people tend to kind of group into a bubble. So when there's a university or there's a big hospital that's Adventist or any kind of Adventist community, yeah, that's what the bubble is. There's a certain series of either opinions that people might have that are very typical per se for someone who's been stuck in a bubble for a long time. You know, whether we're talking about LGBTQ as an example, right? There's a lot of strong opinions that people have that are very, very different for those who have been in complete bubble and closed. And I'm not saying everybody in the bubble is going to be like that, but you will find certain opinions to be more closed-minded or more, hey, I haven't experienced a lot of other people type of experience, versus if you live in the middle of nowhere or in a big city that you weren't around Adventists. You know, as a kid, if ever I was outside, I guess, playing with the neighbors, for example, Saturday afternoon, and one of the kids were kicking the ball and we were playing, running around back and forth. The mom wouldn't want me to kick the ball or, shoot a basket, even if it's casual shooting, non-competitive stuff, because those were things that you shouldn't be done on the Sabbath type of, or if I ever, she ever heard me that I went swimming on the Sabbath during the summer, when I was doing coal porting or something, she would question that, or, that type of by the book. When you mean differences, I think of my home church in Indianapolis. Hispanic church, very conservative, everything's a certain way, but the culture there's still super loving, even though things were so much about like rules and laws, and it's very personal, close-knit. It's got so many good things about it, but then, coming to Loma Linda, the vibe is completely different, right? And things might not be super strict like that is like how it is in other places, but they still have that super close-knit in a completely different way, which they're like different cultures, but they're still similar cultures because we're under the same belief.
My parents are very ministry minded, and so we actually house people that are trying to get on their feet. So some of that are homeless people, and I just felt like the culture that I grew up in was very different from the world's culture, and so I sort of hated that. Like, I hated ministry. I hated that my parents took care of like homeless people, because I felt like I could never invite people home. I just was so mad, but I kept that to myself. And searching for satisfaction and happiness in popularity and trying to be a nice person in grades. Like, I just remember growing up very like workspace, like everything you have to work hard for it. Like, if you want to be loved, if you want to be accepted, you have to work hard for it. So when I first heard about God loving you unconditionally, like that just blew everything. Like, it destroyed all the walls that I had in my mind. Like, for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to work for someone's approval or love. I think because it was a very Filipino household, number one, there's that difference of culture, I guess racially. And so growing up, my parents, they spoke a different language. Many times we were very scared of people that were American because we didn't know how to communicate things. And so already communication was hard. And then you also have a very conservative home. And I grew up thinking everyone was Adventist. Like, I was very sheltered. My dad wanted to homeschool me, but it didn't end up working that way. I went to public school my whole life until I went to Bible college. So you can imagine how weird it was for me when I would go to school and I would tell my parents what I ate. And they were saying, there was pork in there? Like, you're not supposed to eat pork. And I was like, everyone's eating it though. Like, I thought everyone's allowed to eat that stuff. And so it was very different. There was a lot of things that I was trying to figure out. It wasn't concrete or set. Like, there was a lot of things my parents were still trying to figure out, being an Adventist in a different country, and at the same time trying to raise a family in a country where that's not their first language.
So Eurocentric, just the term Eurocentric, I did not know what that meant till I actually came to the States. In my journey right now as a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, I would say Eurocentric Adventism is a particular imagination of Adventism that is formed and also is perpetuated by a certain demographic in the world, which in this case would be Europeans. And when you start to look at it from that perspective, you see how this particular Adventism, this particular way of doing Adventism is so pervasive. It's all across the globe. And it's so pervasive, but it's also so powerful that in many instances, it also like trumps the cultural particularities of Adventism in local contexts, right? So I saw that in Sri Lanka. And now going back to Sri Lanka, now if I were to go back, and I have gone back a couple of times, I'm so sensitized to the fact that this is not how we could worship. Like the possibilities are so much more. I mean, what if we were to start to really think through our culture a little bit? Let's talk about our history of Sri Lanka. Let's talk about Tamil culture. Let's talk about Sinhalese culture, and let's start to now have conversations about, okay, what portions or what aspects of this culture are not are not against or not at variance with Seventh-day Adventist theology. And if they're not, then why can't we incorporate some of those things into our mode of worship? I remember when I was a kid, at 10 years old in Sri Lanka, my pastor did an evangelistic series, and there was an entire family of like 10 people who joined our church. And they were on fire. Fire for Jesus, fire for all that stuff, fire for Daniel, Revelation, all the prophecy things, and which I was familiar with at the time. And I also remember they got baptized at the church, all of them, take 10 of them. Now they were Buddhists, okay? They were Buddhists coming into Adventism. A week or two later, I saw this in church, 3 or 4 of them in the middle of our church service, like bashing the pastor in the middle of his sermon. It was the craziest thing. As a kid, I was like imagine divine service, right? And like pastor's preaching, and these people are like going back and forth, just straight mid-sermon. And I was just wondering, what is going on? And then at the time, I didn't know what was going on. But like over time, I think my parents told me eventually that they had a tough time living out some of their own like traditions and their own cultural things within our denomination, within our church, to the point where they felt like they were being just constrained. And I don't know, again, the specifics of why they actually react in that way. But I would like to think that they came to a point where they realized that they had to dissolve their individuality, they had to dissolve their cultural particularities for the sake of a version of the gospel. So I see the gospel as this life operating system for us. You see, we existed before the gospel showed up, but when you say, I want to accept Jesus Christ, what that means is God then puts the operating system on us, so that's why we are a new creation. But that doesn't mean that we lose Sri Lankanness. It just means that our Sri Lankanness finds a new purpose. It's reinvigorated, it's reimagined with a new set of lenses. But that's not what I see right now. And so we've come to a point where we are worshiping, or we are sacrificing our uniqueness, we're sacrificing individualities for the sake of a certain imagination of Adventism.
If I could describe the Adventist culture that I want, I definitely want it to be Jesus cultured. I think many times people are very scared to show up to church because of how they look, how they dress, how they act. And then when you study the Bible, like especially as a Bible worker, when I share with my Bible study friends that this is who Jesus is, that he loves you regardless of who you are, that having a relationship with him is what changes you, and you don't have to change that before you meet him. Like, if we can just be open-minded the way Jesus was and accepting the way Jesus was, I feel like that would change a lot of how we grow up in church.
If you were to ask me at 17, 18 years old, my perception of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it would be primarily white. It would be very politically conservative. It would be kind of holding the views of Ellen White on par with the Bible. There were very particular things about the group of people that I grew up around that I thought were the rule. I thought that this was the existence for all people within the umbrella of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the differences, the subgroups that were not like me, were very small. They were kind of like on the fringes. But what I belonged to was the primary and the good understanding of the Adventist Church. Through doing Humans of Adventism for the past several years, I have discovered how little I know about what Adventism is. And I don't mean doctrine, I mean how people live it out and what's important to them, and how they incorporate a belief system into their life and how it affects them. You know, there are whole congregations of people from various countries, from various ideologies, and there are cultural practices and traditions and all kinds of things that I'm only discovering at almost 30 years old. You know, there are still so many groups of people that I've never touched, that I've never heard from, that I don't know. And that was shocking, you know, because both my things that I liked and accepted about Adventism as I knew it, and the things that I rejected were all based on my reality. They were all based on what I'd been exposed to. So when I would talk to somebody who didn't grow up like me, the things that I cared about, that I was mad about, that I rejected, they weren't always even on the minds of somebody else, because we'd grown up in such different areas.